Bibliophiles of the internet, my name is Adri, and today I'm here to recommend some queer books with covers that represent different pride flags. I think you'll catch on to what I mean by this as we get into it, but basically I'm going to be recommending or suggesting queer books that have a design or color scheme that either subtly or overtly showcases the pride flag each book represents. Before we get into it, I did want to say that this prompt was given to me on Instagram. I put out a question sticker, got a ton of great responses, and then I put my favorites into an exclusive Patreon poll, so this video was actually voted on and made possible by my incredible patrons who I appreciate so much. If you want to support me and the channel, that is the absolute best way to do so, and it makes a huge difference. My Patreon is linked in every single one of my videos if you would like to check that out, but with all of that said, let's get into it. Starting off strong, the first book I thought of for this was Cool for the Summer by Dahlia Adler. This obviously represents the bisexual flag, and it's a queer coming-of-age contemporary story about Larissa, who's been crushing on the golden boy Chase Harding for years, and as a new school year kicks off, he is finally taking notice. However, there's also a new girl named Jasmine who Larissa may have had a steamy summer fling with, but her friends don't know that they've met before, and they don't know that Larissa is not actually straight like they think. I love that this book cover just screams bisexual if you know what to look for, and I love that both of the love interests are reflected in the glasses. It's such a nice touch. I also love that if you really boil it down, the premise of this story is basically like, what if Sandy was queer in Greece, and what if the summer fling that changed her life was actually a girl? I think the story really excavates that love triangle trope and makes it inherently different because it's in a queer context. It is a deeply emotional story of self-discovery, and I think it does such a great job of exploring and challenging bi-erasure first and foremost, because the story shows that multiple complex things can be true at once. The person you were doesn't invalidate the person you are becoming, just like being attracted to more than one person or more than one kind of person doesn't invalidate the relationships you choose to cultivate. It's such a thoughtful, complex exploration of embracing bisexuality and self-acceptance, and I definitely recommend it. The next pride flag book I want to bring to your attention is In Deeper Waters by F.T. Lukens. It was actually my friend Nico who brought this up after we read the book, but this cover represents the pan flag, and because both characters are very open with their attraction, that completely checks out. This is queer historical fantasy with a tiny splash of fairy tale reimagining, and it's about Prince Tal, who's finally going on his coming-of-age tour across the kingdom after having lived a very sheltered life in the palace. Tal has been kept out of the public eye because his family doesn't want anyone to find out that he possesses very powerful, very dangerous magic. So he's craving adventure, and no sooner does his tour begin than he's kidnapped by pirates, and now it's up to his family and a beautiful, mysterious boy he rescued from a sinking ship to get him back. As I said in my June wrap-up, this book is not about queer pirates. It's queer and it has pirates in certain parts who may or may not be queer, but the two main characters are not queer pirates. And I want to be clear in that the word pansexual is never used in the book, and the word queer is never used in the book either, but that's because this story is set in a queer normative fantasy world where anyone has the capacity to be attracted to anyone regardless of identity, gender, or traits. And as a pan person myself, that's kind of what pansexuality is. With that said, it's such a fun, rip-roaring, queer fantasy adventure that's made up of so many different parts. There's quests and subplots and mysterious curses with this super soft, tropey queer romance between magic boys layered on top, and it brings me so much joy. It's fun and exciting to read, and the story itself is almost shape-shifting as you read through it. It feels like 10 fantasy adventures in one, which is fantastic. But it also centers this really soft romance between two characters who are learning to trust each other and themselves. It's a great time, and you should definitely check it out. The next one is kind of a gimme, but I would take any chance to recommend this book, and that would be Ace by Angela Chen. Obviously, you can tell from the title and the cover that this represents the ACE flag. It's a nonfiction collection of essays, research, and testimonies all about asexuality, and it's an examination of how compulsory sexuality creates limiting and harmful societal norms. This is one of the best books I have ever read. It is such an insightful, informative, compassionate look at asexuality that validates almost every imaginable form and iteration of aceness. One of my favorite things about this collection of essays is its commitment to intersectionality. Angela Chen understands that asexuality is often inextricable from racial dynamics, gender identity, disability, socioeconomics, and so many other factors. I will never forget my experience listening to this book because I was constantly on the brink of tears. There is so much power, so much clarity, so much validation in what Angela Chen is offering in these essays. Whether you're ace or allo, this is essential reading that will crack your world wide open. And if you know absolutely nothing about asexuality, there is literally no better starting point than this. Next up, I want to recommend one of my absolute favorite books, and that is The Witch King by H.E. Edgmon. This cover represents the gay flag, the MLM flag, the Achillean flag, however you want to phrase it. It's the flag that represents men who are attracted to other men, other masculine people, and and potentially other queer folks. The Witch King is about a trans boy named Wyatt who escaped this fairy world known as Aslan, where he was persecuted for being a witch. After he transitions and acclimates himself to the human world, he figures his ties with Aslan are forfeit, but then Amir, the fairy prince he was betrothed to as a child, tracks Wyatt down in the human world to make good on their engagement and bring him back. Again, I want to be very clear and say that I don't think either Wyatt or Amir use the word gay to describe themselves, but again, this is a queer normative fantasy world where labels don't really matter anyways. I'm referencing this flag not only for its matching colors, but because Wyatt, who's a guy, is attracted to Amir, who's also a guy, and vice versa. That's Achillean, that's MLM, that's very broadly what this flag represents. I'll say it again, The Witch King is the dark, twisted, gritty, angry, anti-fascist queer fantasy romance of my dreams. A.G. Edgmon gave me everything, and there is nothing else I shall want. My favorite thing about this story is that Wyatt is this messy trans hero absolutely full of rage, and not only is that rage warranted based on what he's been through, but it's also necessary because you need rage to destroy corrupt, broken systems. As trans people, we are often not allowed to show our frustration and anger with a system that actively harms and limits us, and that's why his rage feels so cathartic. It has an incredible romance, it's dark, it's funny, it's fucked up, it's self-righteous, it has twisty court politics and found family and queerness. Just please read this book. And in case you missed it, I also got to have a conversation with H.E. Edgmon about what went into making this story, and I will link that down below in case you would like to watch. I would also like to once again humbly recommend Anna on the Edge by AJ Sass. I didn't realize this until AJ mentioned it themselves in one of their recent panels, which I will link down below, but this cover has the colors of the non-binary flag, which is great because it's a non-binary book. It's a middle grade contemporary story about Anna, who's an ice skater, and she's questioning her gender when she starts experiencing some discomfort around her new skating program, which is themed around this idea of being a princess. When a new boy who happens to be trans starts coming to the same rink, he mistakes Anna for a boy, and Anna chooses not to correct him and instead uses that as an opportunity to explore that new space. This is such a fantastic story of self-discovery and exploration, and especially for young readers who are just learning about gender identity or maybe thinking about their gender, it provides a wonderfully safe space. There's this prevalent idea that being non-binary means abandoning, hating, or rejecting traditionally gendered things or behaviors, which is not true. Anna's journey of coming into her own non-binary identity isn't about hating femininity or even adopting gender neutralism, which is fake, but just giving herself space to explore what's right for her. You'll notice I'm not using they them pronouns for Anna because she doesn't use those pronouns and she's still exploring her pronouns, and that doesn't make her any less non-binary. And even having that level of representation that expands and challenges how people think about non-binary identity makes a huge difference. It's an incredibly thoughtful and heartwarming story about making space for what is true about yourself, and I genuinely think everyone should read it. I also couldn't make this video without recommending May the Best Man Win by Z.R. Ellor. This book has all the colors of the trans flag, and unsurprisingly, it's about a trans boy named Jeremy who's cheer captain and student body president, and now that he's transitioned, he wants to prove himself by running for homecoming king. Not only will Jeremy have to face down the entire student body, including the haters and transphobes, but his biggest competition is someone who just happens to be the star quarterback, head of the homecoming committee, and also his ex. I legitimately have not stopped thinking about this book ever since I finished it. It's a story that centers angry, traumatized, grieving, messy queer characters who are actively hurting each other and themselves as a trauma response. I'm not gonna lie, it is a challenging story that forces the reader to feel discomfort and to witness the pain these characters have internalized, the horrible things that have been put onto them by society and their loved ones. It's not a story that shies away from the weight of impossible demands that we put on teenagers for perfection, assimilation, and self-erasure in some cases. Yes, it's about these two awful exes sabotaging each other's chances of becoming homecoming king, but it's also so much more than that. It's an examination of the vicious cycles of self-destruction that we find ourselves in and how we bring our baggage into every choice that we make. It is a hell of a ride, to say the very least, and I don't think cis or non-queer audiences will ever be able to truly see it for what it is, but it is so worth reading even if that's the case. My last official recommendation is Let's Talk About Love by Kann. This is obviously for the ace flag, and it's a new adult romance about a biromantic asexual black character named Alice whose girlfriend dumped her after Alice came out to her as ace. Alice is working at a library for the summer and has pretty much sworn off romance, but things get complicated when she gets a new coworker named Takumi who is very clearly into her, and then she has to decide if it's worth it to take a chance on their relationship and let him see her for who she really is. This is one of the softest, safest, sweetest romances romances ever, and it is criminal how many people have not read this book. Not only do we get like a god-tier romance between two characters of color, but we get to see what a safe, healthy Elo-Ace relationship looks like. And most importantly, this story shows Ace readers that we don't have to compromise any part of ourselves to find happiness. It's a story that celebrates open communication, mutual respect, and the fact that asexual people are just as worthy, deserving, and capable of love as anyone else. I get a little emotional every time I remember this is a real book because some people really think that asexual romance is an oxymoron that cannot or should not exist, but it does exist, and we exist in so many ways. If you like romance, if you like ace rep, and you haven't read this yet, you should seriously read this book. Before anyone comments that I forgot these books, I think two honorable mentions are I Wish You All the Best by Mason Deaver, which has the non-binary flag colors, and Honey Girl, which has a sort of lesbian flag color scheme as well. I feel like I Wish You All the Best is the most well-known non-binary book, and I also mentioned Honey Girl in my last recommendations video, so I didn't want to do it again. But there you go, I did not forget them, I know they exist. I do have one additional suggestion, which means a book I know of but I haven't personally read yet, and that is Gender Euphoria, edited by Laura Kate Dale. I think the flag represented is obvious. It's a nonfiction anthology featuring transspec writers, and it's meant as a reframing of transness in the context of euphoria, or joy, as opposed to dysphoria. The writers were free to interpret this prompt as they saw fit and to share a story about something that brings them gender euphoria and affirms their gender or makes them feel good about themselves. I own this book and I cannot wait to read it. I'm also going to include a picture of the spine, which represents even more transspec flags like genderqueer, gender fluid, non-binary, and intersex, just to name a few. I'm so happy this book exists because there's this predominant narrative that trans people are trans or transition because we hate ourselves or because we experience some kind of intense discomfort with ourselves. And while that can be true in some cases or to some extent, that's not the whole story, nor is it everyone's experience. Oftentimes we transition or identify as trans because we find another way of living for ourselves that brings us joy and makes us feel like ourselves, which is inherently a joyous experience. I cannot wait to get into this and immerse myself in all these different forms and iterations of trans joy across the trans spectrum. I think more people should definitely check this out. So those are just a handful of queer pride flag books. Hopefully it goes without saying that all queer books are good and valid, and just because some might have covers that reflect the representation within doesn't make the other ones any less. Obviously this video is not an exhaustive collection, but if you know of any other queer pride flag books, feel free to keep the conversation going and drop those down below in the comments. But that's everything I had to recommend for you today. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.